There's a generation walking around right now that never really learned how to ask for help. Not because they think they're better than everyone else, but because somewhere in their childhood, asking for help simply stopped being an option. They came home to empty houses. They figured out dinner. They handled problems alone and never told anyone because there wasn't really anyone to tell. And the strange thing is, they turned out fine. Or at least that's what they'll tell you. Because the truth runs a little deeper than that. And it starts in an era most people have already forgotten. Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. And if you want to understand them, you have to understand what was happening in America and much of the Western world while they were growing up. The 1970s and early 80s were a period of profound adult distraction. Divorce rates were climbing at a rate the country had never seen before. Women were entering the workforce in massive numbers for the first time, which was genuinely progressive and important. But the infrastructure to support that shift hadn't caught up yet. Childcare was minimal, parental leave was almost non-existent. And the cultural assumption that children needed constant supervision, emotional attunement, or deliberate psychological nurturing simply wasn't part of the mainstream conversation. Parents were working, parents were divorcing, parents were figuring out their own lives in a world that was changing faster than anyone had prepared for. And the kids, the Gen X kids, largely came home to empty houses, let themselves in with a key worn around their neck, and got on with it. They became known as Latchkey kids. And that term sounds almost quaint now. But what it actually described was an entire generation learning by necessity to parent themselves. Here's where it gets psychologically interesting. When a child is consistently left to manage on their own, emotionally, practically, socially, something happens in the developing brain. They get very good at it. Genuinely, impressively good. They learn to read situations quickly, to solve problems without asking permission, to tolerate discomfort without falling apart, to trust their own instincts because, frankly, no one else's instincts were available. These are real skills, valuable ones, and Gen X developed them early, which is part of why this generation has a reputation for being capable, adaptable, low drama, and deeply self-sufficient. But here's the strange part. The same process that builds self-reliance also quietly builds something else. It builds an internal message that says, your needs are not a priority. That says, figure it out yourself. That says, needing people is not safe because people are not reliably there. And that message doesn't stay in childhood. It travels into every relationship, into every workplace, into every moment where asking for support would actually make sense. And instead, the Gen X adult goes quiet and handles it alone. Because that's what they learned. That's what worked. That's what kept them going at 10 years old. And the nervous system never got the memo that the circumstances changed. There's another layer to this that doesn't get talked about enough. It's not just that Gen X was physically unsupervised, it's that they were emotionally unsupervised too. The 1970s were not an era of emotional literacy. Parents of that generation, many of them raised by the silent generation, shaped by the Depression and World War II, did not sit their children down and ask how they were feeling. They didn't model emotional processing. They didn't have the language for it. And even if they had, the culture would have found it embarrassing. So Gen X kids didn't just learn to handle dinner alone, they learned to handle grief alone, confusion alone, fear alone. The difficult, complicated, enormous feelings of childhood, the ones that actually need an adult to help you metabolize them, largely got swallowed, pushed down, filed under deal with it. And over time, that becomes a default setting.
Not a conscious choice, but a deep, automatic pattern. You feel something difficult, and before you've even decided anything, your nervous system has already moved to problem-solving mode. Because feeling it, really sitting in it and letting someone else witness it, was never part of the training. Think about what that looks like in adult life. The Gen X friend who shows up and fixes your problem when you needed someone to just listen. The Gen X partner who goes silent under stress instead of reaching out. The Gen X boss who genuinely cannot understand why their team needs reassurance, because reassurance was never in the equation for them. It's not coldness. It's the only emotional language they were ever taught. But this is where the story changes. Because Gen X's self-raised childhood also produced something genuinely remarkable. Resilience. Not the performed kind, not the Instagram kind. The quiet, actual load-bearing kind. This is the generation that watched institutions fail in real time and simply adjusted. They saw their parents' marriages fall apart. They graduated into recessions. They watched the AIDS crisis devastate communities with minimal government response. They lived through 9/11 as adults. And they adapted. Not because they had exceptional support systems, but because they had learned very early that the support systems were not coming, and you had to build your own capacity. They became, as a result, extraordinarily good at tolerating uncertainty, at functioning in chaos, at not needing the situation to be perfect before they could get something done. While boomers expected institutions to work and millennials documented their disillusionment loudly, Gen X had already quietly written off the institutions years earlier and found a way around them. Their cynicism isn't bitterness. It's a survival tool that was calibrated in childhood and never needed to be unlearned because it kept being correct. And yet, the cost is real. Most people don't realize that chronic self-reliance, the kind that started in childhood and never had a reason to stop, eventually becomes its own kind of loneliness. Not the obvious kind. The quiet kind. The kind where you're surrounded by people who care about you and still somehow feel like no one actually sees what's going on inside. Because you never learned to show it. Because showing it felt dangerous. Because the 10-year-old you locked the door, turned on the TV, made dinner, and handled it. And the 45-year-old you is still running that same program. Gen X rarely talks about this. That's almost the point. They'll joke about it. There's a specifically dry, self-deprecating Gen X humor about having raised themselves that is genuinely funny, and also, if you look at it sideways, genuinely sad. The joke is the acknowledgement. The acknowledgement is as close as it gets to asking for help. Go back to the beginning. That child coming home to an empty house, key around the neck, door unlocking, silence inside. They figured it out. They always figured it out. And they grew up to be people who are remarkably, impressively capable, who can handle more than almost anyone else in the room, who don't panic, who don't need to be managed, who get things done in ways that quietly make everyone else's life easier. But understanding Gen X means understanding that the latchkey never really went away. They still carry it. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, what they actually need is not another problem to solve. It's for someone to notice the weight of how long they've been carrying it alone. They probably won't ask. They were never taught to. But the asking isn't the point. The seeing is. And maybe that's what understanding any generation ultimately comes down to.
not judging the armor, but recognizing what it was built to protect against.